conference, Changing the Story, Climate Crisis as a Crisis of Imagination, organized by Climate Kick and the School of Ecopoetics. My name is Grzegorz Czemiel. I'm assistant professor at the Maria Curie Skłodowska University in Lublin. And I have the privilege of hosting this panel, which is titled How to Build, Communicate, and Teach Ecological Intelligence. Now, you can share the stream, which I strongly encourage, because we have some truly fabulous guests this afternoon, whom I would like to introduce now in alphabetical order. So first, we have Aleksandra Gołdys, who is an education design developer at Climate Kick, as well as a sociologist at the University of Warsaw in the Social Challenges Unit. Moreover, she's an activist and facilitator of community-based projects. Welcome to the panel.
Super, thank you.
We also have Eva Meijer, who is an artist, writer, philosopher, and singer-songwriter. She has written 11 books and has been translated into 18 languages. In her work, she engages a large variety of media: performance art, music theater, installation, video, drawing, and photography. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Zoë Skoulding, who is an award-winning poet and literary critic who works in fields such as translation, study, and sound, and ecology. She is professor of poetry and creative writing at Bangor University in Wales and has published a number of collections of poetry, most recently Footnotes to Water, as well as The Celestial Setup and A Revolutionary Calendar. Now, thank you all so much for kindly accepting the invitation and joining us today. Now, I have arranged that we have a bunch of questions ready for you, but of course we will be also able to take some questions from the audience, right? So I hope you'll be ready for that. But first of all, I would like to say that, of course, our point of departure for today is the lecture on ecological intelligence delivered by Professor Julia Fiedorczuk. And the subject has been making waves in circles where ecology is taken seriously as the primary challenge for our times. Julia Fiedorczuk argues in her talk that ecological intelligence crucially involves weaving scientific and artistic findings together in order to attune us better to the natural environment. We should be taking advantage of the unique strengths of art and science, she says, to reinforce dialogue rather than fuel old antagonisms such as the famed science wars. She also claims that poetic intuitions about interconnectedness and entanglements in the ecosphere cannot be dismissed as merely aesthetic exercises, but carry the potential to refocus our various cognitive efforts on the larger world. Noticing the world, as she puts it, is the basis of the ethics of care and engagement. Further, she goes on, poetry constitutes a specific laboratory of the imagination, where new metaphors are forged with the aim of developing an ecological sense of interconnectedness, or, as she terms it, ecological intelligence. So we, the earthlings, as she calls us in the lecture, need this competence very much. First, to develop new ways of thinking, and second, to form more ethical and sustainable relationships in the Anthropocene. Now, in this first round of questions, I'd like to throw a little bit more light on the concept, asking our panelists to share with us how they understand ecological intelligence from the perspective of their work. So first off, I would like to ask Aleksandra Gołdys, what would be a sociologist's perspective on ecological intelligence? Is ecological imagination a question of thinking in terms of systems, emotions, or both? How is sociology engaging these topics today, and does it have room for such issues within its contemporary paradigms?
If it's okay, I will be talking from the perspective of my organization because it's very like practical, and I prefer to not be theoretist here. So what I deadly need when I'm thinking about ecological intelligence, I need several elements or several notions or modules. One is community and this perspective of common, which is very missing, especially in politics and policy dimension. So we are trying in EIT Climate Kick, we are trying to build community as something very genuine, because it's very obvious to talk about, it's easy to talk about community, which is only a slogan, but to really experience community is very hard. So for me, the first element of this ecological intelligence is this community, not only between humans being, of course, like we have to feel community with other beings and with planet itself. The second element is connected with special approach to knowledge, which shouldn't be solid and in stone. It should be like a process. So in our projects, we are trying to think about knowledge as a knowing rather. And I remember from Julia Fiedorczyk lecture that she was also using this term knowing, which is more like a process and motion. So in our documents, we are talking about closing loops of intelligence gathering. And I think that this is very important, that people not only know something or they want to know something, but they are trying to develop their knowing constantly as a process. And third will be very about experience. It also sounds a little bit obvious, but we are trying in our projects to really make people not only read about what is the system we want to change, but also to like feel that. So that's why we spend a lot of time, not in only classical research, which is very dividing people between the researcher and the object, we can say, but we spend a lot of time in deep listening process. So we were trying to build the whole narratives of different type of people from the systems. In my example, system is a city or a region in which we are undertaking our processes. So that will be the third element. So first is community and common. The second is knowing and learning loops, we can say. And third is experience on something very material. It's not a good word, something which you really can feel, not only think about. Very last thing, it also sounds like a slogan, and sorry for that, but in ecological intelligence is also about long-term thinking and feeling. So what is missing very often is that we have this tendency to think about present. And I deeply believe that one of the crucial elements of this intelligence is really trying to look in a very long perspective and also feel responsible for this long-term perspective. So that will be the fourth element from my list. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for this. I was only thinking about where does thinking in terms of systems fit in your breakdown of the essential components here. Certainly, thinking in terms of systems is not something that we are capable of through direct experience, can we? Right? Because it feels to me that it goes beyond our direct experience. So where would you place it in this little map that you've just drawn?
You are so right. Sorry that I'm interrupting you, but I even remember the quotation from one of our stakeholders, like the person who is taking part in our process, and this person told me, "I don't know any system. I only know people." And this is so right. So this is the drama I'm experiencing on a daily basis, because the all documents I'm promoting when I'm working for my organization is like repeating this system thinking as a pillar of what we are trying to do. And then we are doing concrete processes in the place, in the city or in the region, and there is no system. So I'm treating system only as a tool which make our deeper understanding of complexity of reality a little bit easier. So for me, system is only like a term which make us more capable of grasp complexity of reality. So I'm using this as in a very technical way. I don't think that we should think about system as something powerful, because only we are powerful, not systems.
Right, that is a very interesting observation, a fascinating angle to think about systems. So thank you so much for this. Now, to look at the problem from yet another perspective, I would like to turn to Eva Meijer and ask you about your experience and expertise in the field of animal rights and animal studies. Now, I was wondering what we can learn from animals in terms of developing human ecological intelligence, or perhaps I should say more than human ecological intelligence. So can animals help us grasp some aspects of ecological intelligence? What would be your perspective on this?
Yes, thank you very much, Gregor, and also Aleksandra. I will return to. I really liked your answer, so I will also return to the points that you raised. But first of all, about this question, what can we learn from the other animals about ecological intelligence? I think that one of the great challenges of our time in the face of all the ecological problems that we are encountering is that we should decenter the human. So very often there's this opposition between the human on the one hand and then nature on the other hand, or the human on the one hand and animals on the other hand. In order to address ecological problems, we need to understand that we are part of all of these entanglements with other animals. In many ways. And when we turn to the concept of ecological intelligence, well, the first thing is that as humans, we are not the only intelligent beings. I wrote a lot about animal languages, and language is very often seen as this specific human capacity, but it turns out that other animals also speak. They also have ways of creating meaning, either vocally or through color patterns on their skin or with scents and all of these things. Learning to listen to the other animals can help us develop another attitude that is not simply focused on the human, because humans have been obsessed with humans for a very long time. And I think that one of the threats in thinking about climate problems is that it's still about kind of the survival of our species and this sort of idea of, well, if we tune into nature, then nature will help us survive or something. But what also came up in the talk that Julia Fidorchuk gave was that there are actual problems with appropriating knowledge of others. And she discussed this in the case of human communities, of human indigenous communities. And I would be a bit careful. I mean, we're using animals for many, many, many things, often in very violent ways. And I think that the insights from decolonial theory should also help us navigate the question of listening to animals and not sort of taking their knowledge from them and then using it for our own survival, but actually becoming attuned in new ways. So when it comes to ecological intelligence, many non-human animals have different ways of navigating the world that we are already connected to, right? So in the case of domesticated animals, there's a lot of interspecies communication. There are also many ways in which humans and other animals already live together in sustainable ways, and that can help us think of new ways of existing with other animals. And all of these questions are also deeply political. So very often we think of animals as kind of outside of the political paradigm or outside of political communities. But already the question of language, who gets to speak, who gets to speak in poetry, but also who gets to speak democratically, these are all political questions. So to sort of give a guideline, I think that our task as humans is to develop a new kind of attitude, to be very aware of the different kinds of violence that we enact upon other beings, but also open to their worlds, the worlds that we share with them. And I think this idea of an ethics of care that Julia Fedorchuk spoke about can guide us, but also the general idea of poetry, being open to new forms of language, to new forms of meaning creation. All of these things can play a role in navigating the world differently through looking at other animals. And I also think that the things that Aleksandra discussed, so building community, thinking about knowledge as a process and not as a kind of capacity or something that we have, a thing, and starting from experience. I think these three guidelines actually can also help us refigure relationships with other animals. And ultimately, it's not a task for the humans alone, right? How do we extract knowledge from other animals and take it from there? No, it's really about entering a respectful dialogue, building new communities, forming new forms of knowledge in a multi-species way. And this can kind of help us overcome this obsession with the human that we need to overcome in order to build a better world for everybody.
Thanks so much for this. I'm really glad that you mentioned this idea of poetry as exhibiting a certain kind of hospitality or a certain kind of capacity for holding or inviting diverse languages. And this is precisely what I wanted to ask about, what I wanted to ask Zoë Skoulding about, because I was thinking about this question of whether literature can augment our ecological intelligence, can it enhance it, and perhaps whether poetry is somehow uniquely predisposed to provide space for dialogue with science and space for those other voices.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And and I've also really enjoyed those last two answers. Yeah, a lot I'd agree with there. And thinking back to Julia's talk and her point about poetry as really demonstrating the inseparability of matter and meaning. So that when we think of a poem, it's language, it's sound, it might have a visual form, and all of those are working together. It's a material thing that's been created. So I think sometimes when people consider the question of communicating environmental issues, they think of sort of communicating language as a channel of communication. And it is true that poetry can also help to generate new metaphors. It can help to find a language for things that we want to talk about and be a kind of laboratory for developing that. But also it does something else, because it also often resists straightforward modes of communication to do something with sound or to do something that is more complex, and that we might enjoy in a more physical, more embodied way. And so it's in language, but it's also doing something that is often a little bit different from other forms of language. And I think because of this, because it has this particularly important kind of sounded element, it can be a form that helps us to engage with different kinds of listening. So yeah, really interested that Eva mentioned listening is particularly important. And of course there are different kinds of listening, and sometimes we listen to something and grasp it straight away. Sometimes we listen to something and we're kind of intrigued by it, and often that's the case with listening to animals or things in the world, and it can also be the case with poetry. And I think that kind of listening that kind of stretches us out towards what we don't perhaps fully know is really one of the values, particularly of poetry. And the Canadian poet Stephen Collis, in fact, says, "I think sometimes poetry is not made of language. It's some strange silence or grave emptiness or dark material that stands in the place of language, mimicking language, fooling or confusing us, but having other intents, a different destination." And so that idea that it's opening up something different means that it puts us in a place for perhaps appreciating other kinds of phenomena or awareness at the same time as thinking about these forms of language. And I think it's true that as we think about ecological crisis, we want to turn our attention to the non-human, more than human world, but also we want to avoid perhaps representing other species in ways that sort of appropriate them, or perhaps that don't acknowledge our connectedness to them. So we're always thinking about relationship. And so poetry especially is this medium that's materially entangled with language, but it's always thinking about these kind of outer limits of encounter, or often, perhaps sometimes not, but the poetry that particularly interests me is doing that. And so Yulia was talking about Karan Barad, the physicist who talks about matter and meaning, on ontology and epistemology as being connected, and her idea, it comes from this idea that the behavior of matter really changes according to the way that it's observed. So the activity of observation can't be separated from phenomena. And so if we think about poetry that is addressing or is addressed by the non-human world, we can really think about how we're connected, and poetry is a kind of interesting medium for doing this, and has been for a long time. And perhaps thinking also of what Eva's saying about the listening to other creatures. If we think about, for example, Shelley, the romantic poet Shelley, he talks about he addresses the skylark, is inspired by the skylark song to write an ode to it, and so he kind of hopes that he can learn from this bird in order to communicate something to the world, and he says it's got the harmonious madness of its song, and what he wants is for he says the world should listen then as I am listening now. So he wants to kind of bring the world to his feet, all listening to his kind of wonderful voice as a poet, but he's kind of standing outside the world, and is also seeing the bird as this kind of messenger of the spirit world, who is also outside of the world in some sense, and so he sees his role as poet as being sort of perhaps talking to the material world from some other space, and I think there might be other ways of kind of looking at what that relationship is, and especially thinking back to Karan Barad, because she's talking about the world as this performance of active elements that are always connecting with each other. And so if we thought of poetry as really being this entanglement of matter and meaning. We could perhaps think of a different kind of example. So another kind of bird-human collaboration I'd like to just suggest as an example is the UK poet Emma Bennett. And she does these wonderful performances where she listens to birdsong on headphones and then improvises human language in the same patterns. And it's really funny and beautiful work. And I think it's also interesting in the way that the poet then kind of becomes a mimic, sort of pushing human language into something that's actually shaped by a bird-like process. And so sometimes people think of science as a kind of repetitive or experimental process, and poetry as self-expression. But I would say this is an example of poetry that actually uses a sort of observational process or a listening process to make something that's really extraordinary and surprising, that is somehow collaboratively formed. And so if we think about poetry as a kind of performative process of encountering the world, it opens up all of these possibilities. And so Julia was talking especially about documentary poetry that engages with particular kinds of knowledge or information. Or it might use a process of observation, as in the examples I've given, but it activates language relationships in a performative way. And so it can make new relationships, new knowledge. And I think poetry does draw us into communities. I mean, certainly there are communities of poets, but it also helps us to think about how we might extend those forms of community to the more than human world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this contribution. So what emerges from your answers, I'd say, is something that we could capture in a rather tentative definition of perhaps ecological intelligence, consisting in a rebalancing of listening and expression, so as to bring forth the possibility of new kinds of communities and, of course, new kinds of knowledge within those communities. So I feel that has been a very, very informative. Thank you so much. I would like to gradually move to the second round of questions and ask you about different ways of implementing ecological intelligence, or perhaps developing ecological intelligence. Daniel Goldman, who's written on ecological intelligence, has a very interesting argument. He claims that ecological imagination needs to be taught, and in a very specific way, because evolution has not really equipped us with any kinds of alarm systems, that would be sensitive to changes that occur at such vast scales. This is something that our organisms are not fit to perceive and process, really, right? So we have to teach ourselves to do that in a way. And so it becomes pertinent to ask how we can teach or stimulate the development of ecological intelligence. So a little bit of strategizing now. And I would like also to start now again with Aleksandra and ask you, what are the key institutions you think we should focus on while campaigning to boost the development of ecological imagination? What are the crucial nodes, in the systems that surround us, where, what are the strategic places that we should work on?
I believe that no type of organization or institution should be excluded from building capacity in ecological intelligence. There is no time left to really start with schools, then we are going to universities, and then we will work with museums or whatever. Like, everyone has to incorporate the dimension of building ecological intelligence, and this is one of goal we are trying to achieve in our program. So when we start working with, for example, one city, we would love every single person in this city as a system, sorry for this word, to really think about the future. That is the first thing. Think about like planet, and think about all other stuff which are connected to that. I really love this one sentence from Julia lecture, that poetry is giving concentrated form of attention. Like, we are obsessively thinking in our institution how to really make people able to notice that this problem is happening. Sorry, I'm talking very from the Polish perspective and East Europe perspective. So very often during our processes, someone is telling us, okay, this is a problem, but we can wait. We'll have bigger problems here to solve. And I believe that really testing all these elements or tools which are bringing our attention to that, this is what we should focus right now. And when I was listening to Eva and Zoe, I was so jealous, because like public institution and institution as mine, we are operating with the language which is so not attractive, which is so detached from people. Like, when people start to read our documents, they totally trying to get rid of that after one page. So I truly believe that one of the, trying to answer your question, Grzegorz, first is really to not to think which institutions should be interested in building ecological intelligence, but to really think that every institution should do that. Second is really to incorporate different form of language, because the language which is dominating in policy, especially educational policies or climate policies, we can say, this is this kind of language which is not really drawing attention of anyone. So that is the second thing. And third, sorry, I will be coming back to my first answer, to create conditions that people won't be only thinking about that, but they will be also experiencing that. So we organized several educational experiments last year. And one of this experiment from Italy was to really make people be in a place where there is no water, for example, for several days. And so it's not only like a technical question, like imagine that you have no water in your city, but we are really placing people in a situation that this shortages is experienced by you. And you have to really rethink your life, taking into account that will happen. So it's not only about alarming people, but I prefer this sentence, drawing attention, or a concentration form of attention, to really notice what is happening. And based on that, I believe that people have this natural tendency to try to understand what can we do. And this is the source of innovation. So in my organization, we overuse term innovation, like we deadly need innovation, we need innovation. But we cannot just jump to innovation without these previous steps. And first steps is to notice what is happening. Second is to look for others who want to work or think with you on that. And then is how to recreate the conditions in which we are living to really make the better future happening. Last sentence here. I think that, and that was super visible in both your lecture and Julia lecture, that every division is super risky and dangerous. And from many complex reasons, there are the powerful structure who really likes to divide our reality. And what I think it's really important in building ecological intelligence is to really think how to connect those divisions. So, for example, first division between theory and practice, like ecological intelligence is not only like intelligence like thinking, it's intelligence in practicing. So I like this term from Michel Foucault, was writing that practices are like a spaces when our thinking and articulation is meeting with our activities. And this is exactly what I'm thinking about ecological intelligence, that we have to create a space where our thoughts and our activities are together jointly. It wasn't very practical answer, sorry for that.
Well, I think that was a wonderful answer, and I'm very much, I would very much agree. And I really like this perspective where practice and theory, especially, which is especially painful divide experienced in the academia, right? And something that can be, easily, that's something that, academics can be easily accused of, right? Myself included. So I think working with that division is very important now. Thanks so much for this. Now, perhaps moving on, I would like to ask Eva Meijer how we can mobilize various forms of art, such as those you practice yourself, to turn them into vehicles of ecological intelligence. Specifically, I was wondering about this dilemma of anthropocentrism, which you yourself brought up in your previous answer, because anthropocentrism is a difficult problem, because our art, right, and our creativity is essentially anthropocentric. So how can we make it accommodate also other perspectives, so that it becomes more attuned or more in sync with with the ecological intelligence?
Yeah, thank you. And so first of all, I think that it's very important to criticize divisions, like between academia and art and all of these things. And also in the way that we are speaking about it now is meant to kind of bring out something. But I also want to emphasize that within academia, there are many different traditions. So I'm a philosopher. I work at the University of Amsterdam. And then you have like continental philosophy, which is more narrative and critical. There's analytic philosophy, which is more perhaps after the system of the life science and sciences. And so I want to be a bit careful about creating oppositions there as well. And I'm saying this because I think that within different fields, there are different things that you can articulate. One of the reasons why I like doing philosophy, also academic philosophy, is that it has a certain abstraction. So you can be very precise and use words as tools. And one of the reasons why I like writing novels is because you can make a completely different type of argument, which focuses more on the emotion, but also the ambiguities of life. So in philosophy, I can be more argumentative and say, okay, life is like this. And in the novel, I do something else. And then when you play music, then you have another way of communicating with others. And I think that within these language games, there are different types of knowledge that are generated that can solve different aspects of our question. And like Aleksandra said, we need work from all directions. So not simply different institutions, but also different forms of language use, different language games. Then to your question, how can we mobilize these and how can we avoid anthropocentrism? I think one of the ways in which we can avoid anthropocentrism we already discussed, and that is by listening, being attentive. I also liked in Julia's talk that she mentioned poetry as a way of learning how to show up in your life. I think that's indeed something that we forget, and that's very specific. That's a very nice and wise way of saying it. And when you are attentive and open up, then you already are other regarding, in a sense, and overcoming yourself. I also think that our ways of creating meaning now are not solely human. It is already more than human. And that is also the position of many of the theorists that were discussed earlier. We are already entangled with others. So yes, we should do the sort of explicit critique in order to overcome anthropocentrism, but also tell stories that show that we were already entangled with these others. And one of the things I thought about when Zoe was talking is the work of Pauline Oliveros, who writes about, she was a musician and composer who wrote about deep listening. And deep listening is a way of actually listening, so with your ears. I think that we are now using listening in two ways, either as kind of the metaphor of being attentive, but also as an actual listening practice. And Oliveros developed some, she called it sonic meditation, so ways in which people can become more attuned to their surroundings by actually listening to what's going on. And that has the quality, these meditations or these practices, of not only, because we tend to think about the world as kind of static environment, but we also need to learn to listen to the things that we are not sure are there, or to the sort of newness, and that carries a sort of promise in it. So that's kind of the response to what Zoe was saying as well. And perhaps poetry also invites us to listen beyond what we know. So how do we overcome anthropocentrism? By listening, being attentive, drawing on knowledge generated in different language games. I'm a political philosopher, so I think about justice and these kinds of things. This maybe not really has a space in this panel, and maybe it does. But and these are all different lenses through which we can encounter these questions. And one of the final thing I wanted to mention is through actual encounters with others. So I think maybe this is also what Aleksandra was hinting at. The spaces we need are sometimes actual spaces in which we engage with actual others. And one of the things I discussed in Dutch politics is that very often politicians tend to decide about lives of many non-human animals. Are we going to kill them or not? Without knowing anything about the animals that they are talking about. They often don't even know what they look like. And actually going outside, meeting them is, I think, the first prerequisite for making any kind of informed decision. So yes, actual encounters with others should also be part of that. But and your question was, how can we mobilize different forms of art? I think that's a very difficult question to ask from someone who makes art, because I don't think art is for anything. You know, it's not instrumental. It actually defies instrumentality. So you can't think about it in that sense. Then you need to turn on a different hat and say, oh yes, we should teach poems in schools, and we should rewrite governmental reports so that people can read them more easily. So yes, we should do that as well, but I don't really have anything to say about that.
Well, great. I think you've said quite quite enough on this bundle of topics. I'm very glad that you brought up the deep listening dimension of the musical or sonic program of Pauline Oliveros, and I have myself been very much attracted to this, and it seems to me that the fascinating thing about it is that what she tries to do sometimes is to produce within the listeners a kind of awareness, or to kind of guide them towards an awareness of themselves listening, and that ultimately at the end it's not the music that you're listening to, but you're listening to yourself listening, and therefore become more deeply aware of being an embodied an embodied creature that lives in this world here, which is full of sounds, right? And that, of course, stimulates interesting responses to to the world and to all kinds of otherness. So thanks so much for that. And political philosophy has its place here. I can reassure you, we'll get there at a later point.
There's one thing I want to add, also because of your remark. I think that very often we tend to think of these things as kind of individual practices of transformation, and these have a place, of course, and it's important for yourself. But I also think we need to think about these in a democratic sense. So when you think about deep listening, I also think we should conceive this as kind of a democratic practice, so that we can collectively be more attuned, because that is the big challenge now, is to sort of translate all of these questions to kind of the bigger picture.
Right. Thanks so much for this. I think this has been already very stimulating. Now I would like to turn to Zoë Skoulding. And obviously, given what has just been said, I would be remiss if I did not, draw on your own reflections and experiences with sound. After all, you are the author of the Museum of Disappearing Sounds, a fantastic collection that tackles a lot of what we've been looking at now, right? Actually, what I wanted to ask you about was rather about something that Julia has mentioned, the decolonization of our minds, and a kind of capacity within poetry to look toward non-Western, non-mainstream ways of thinking present in indigenous or non-dominant languages, or perhaps even pre-verbal sources, as she suggests. But if you're willing to riff on what we've been talking about with regard to sound, I would also love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, no, I really enjoyed it. And in fact, yeah, I've written a little about Oliveras in a monograph that came out last year called "Poetry and Listening: The Noise of Lyric," and so I was particularly interested in that book in thinking about, I suppose, the idea of lyric, but also a kind of situated lyric that when we think about noise in sort of communications theory, it's considered something that shouldn't be there. But you can also think of the effects of poetry, but also the environments of poetry as being also kind of informed by multiplicity, by forms of kind of resonance, which are in a sense noisy. And to me, it's got something to do with being in places and being also in communities, and thinking about poetry in relation to those. And so absolutely sort of not a kind of silent and direct channel of communication, but something that has a musical history, but also a kind of sounded history of happening in places and communities and between languages. And so it does also connect with the other part of your question, because one of the ways that I'm interested in sound in poetry is the way that one language can kind of accommodate echoes of another. And so is that moving away from ecology? I don't think so, because that idea of kind of being haunted by other sounds when we use language, or the idea that poetry as a material form can have these kind of multiple channels open, to me that's something has something to do with the different relationships that are possible within it, that include, as I was saying earlier, relationships, for example, with birds I was talking about there, but also the way that our language is kind of bouncing off this material world that we're part of. As you were saying about Oliveros, makes us sort of aware of our own bodies as sounding instruments, or if we think about John Cage's awareness of the sounds of his own bodies, you feel your own body as material, and you can then understand its relationships with the world, its effect on the world. You understand those in a different way, and I think poetry is about sort of working with that and making that something that can be sort of understood through the senses. Very often, obviously people work in poetry in lots of different ways, but that I suppose is my angle on it in that area. And then you're asking too about decolonization and decolonizing the mind, and kind of looking to sort of non-dominant languages and indigenous languages. I should say, I'm not an expert in sort of translating from indigenous languages or anything like that, but I am interested in those relationships between languages, and I think in poetry it's very clear that certain indigenous traditions do give us some different way of thinking about relationships, which is immensely important, because it's outside of the kind of the Western kind of extractive framework that we're completely locked into very often. And actually translation can also be part of that, which makes it even more complicated. And so even the translation of for example marginalized languages, that can sort of cause problems in terms of the power relations in play. So even then it's not easy. But I just wanted to mention an example of that recently. So sort of how can this work? How can poetry work as a way of kind of opening those channels? I think particularly it forms communities and international communities, and often indigenous languages have a very special place in those. So I'm thinking, for example, of poetry festivals, particularly in Latin America, that I've had the chance to attend and have been really, really fascinating in that context. And so, for example, the Medellin Poetry Festival in Colombia, they do a lot of work just really connecting people from many, many different cultures and languages, and forming communities that are kind of connected through translation. And one poet I met through that was the Quechua poet Yana Lucila Lema Otavalo. And so we were not communicating in her language, Quechua, we were communicating through very bad Spanish, but it was poetry that was giving us the kind of impetus to try and communicate something, and her poems were translated. And so it becomes this point of contact. And then during the pandemic, I had the opportunity to work with her to talk about what we were experiencing in different places. She was in Ecuador, I was on Anglesey, and just trying to translate a poem through Spanish, from Quechua to English, and knowing that it was really a very kind of chancy and difficult process, that I couldn't really represent her language, that I was just trying to understand something about her perspective. It was really kind of enormously enlightening, I think, partly because of the way that she was articulating her experience of community, her experience with place, her experience of the pandemic, which was so different from where I was. And so in a way, it was not just the fact that she was seeing it differently from where she was within her Otavalo community, but also that there was this conversation mediated through poetry that enabled us to think, well, what was she hearing around her? How is she thinking? We were talking about birds, in fact, again, and she was talking about the small birds that were coming out in the lockdown, and I was talking about being surrounded by gulls, and so we were kind of exchanging these ideas, but from vastly different and totally totally kind of unequal perspectives in lots of ways. And so, one is always aware of the kind of difficulty of doing that. And then also, I suppose we're aware that we're communicating, for example, through, I think we were talking on Zoom. And so what does that mean? What are those wires going under the Atlantic made of? And who's had to mine the copper that made that possible? And so you have this conversation between two localities, and yet there are so many aspects of that conversation that you also might want to critique, and so that becomes part of sort of how you might think of that as well. Just what's the kind of the material basis for how we can communicate? How did we meet in the first place? It was by me flying a very long way, so we might think about sort of global community and these valuable insights that we might get from a kind of indigenous language that has this sort of idea of animism still very alive in it. And yet what does it take for us to actually experience that or work with it? That simply opens up more questions. So yeah, I guess that is one example of why it's both a kind of a rich area to think about, but also quite a complicated one.
Right, certainly. Thank you so much. Fantastic. So now in this,
Gregor, can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking about is that all of us are speaking about translation, but in different ways, right? This is that translation from one human language to another, but actually implicated in a whole system of translations, also the material to the vocal, all of these things. Aleksandra was talking about translations of academic insights to organizations, to humans being receptive. We also spoke about translations between human languages and animal languages. And I think that all of these translations are kind of a practice of becoming more worldly. So I like this idea of translation also as a kind of tool that we can use in thinking about ecological intelligence. And one other thing I was thinking about is that much of this is also about pluralizing meaning. I think that as humans, we always have a tendency to go back to what we know and create one fixed idea of meaning, but all of us also keep drawing attention to sort of widening this notion of meaning. And specifically, I was thinking about non-human animal poetry, because this is a question I get after I give talks about animals and language. Do they make jokes? Yes, they do. Do they have morality? Yes, they do. At least that people are researching that. Do they have poetry? We don't know, because a lot of things that people like about animal languages, for example, birdsong is very beautiful. And they think that the birds are creating music, but they're actually often just talking to each other, right? But then a lot of that we don't understand. Whales sing love songs that last for 20 hours. I think there's a lot of poetry in there, but we don't know what they're saying. So that's just sort of a short note. But yeah, the issue of translation could be useful in thinking about it.
Can I build on that? Sorry, Grzegorz, I'm losing
Sure.
the plan.
That's lovely.
But while I was listening to Eva, I thought that this translation, which is such a powerful notion, especially for actor network theory, and Bruno Latour, you've mentioned him, Grzegorz, in your lecture. Translation, in my opinion, is also the mean or the tool to get to the new social but transhuman ontology, because thanks to translation, you can really experience being decentered, because you know that everything is in motion and could be translated to another person on another being experience. So I think that making translation one of the tool of building ecological intelligence is really the mean how we can get to the situation that we really experience new ontology, like in Hart and Negri, new institutionalization of the common, for example. We know that we need new institutions, new habits, new approaches to many things. So I really believe that translation is the way we can get there, and to understand that we are interconnected, and even more, we are interdependence. I really love this word. I cannot pronounce it super correctly, but I think that this word is super powerful, because it means that I need all those other beings to be where I am and to act as I'm acting, because I'm not alone, I'm not separated. And if you now you have another question, so I will pause right now and I will wait for your third question, Grzegorz.
That's okay. We could really get this moving, but since you ask, all right. I think that translation is indeed one of the really important concepts here, and I think I really liked that Julia also brought up this question of translation and emphasized its imperfect character, and in a sense, perhaps it is the imperfect nature of translation that actually makes it so valuable, because there is some margin of resistance or difference that is inherent to translation. And yes, I would say that indeed through translation we become earthlings, if I can put it that way, right? So thanks so much for that. I think that we can move to a more open-ended section of the discussion, where we can connect the dots whichever way you wish. But there is a question that I thought was very important, was a kind of an elephant in the room question, and it was the first question that I actually came up with when the panel was still in the very early stages of its composition, and it is the question whether ecological imagination is ultimately compatible with capitalism, whether in the face of runaway climate change we have time to debate this, whether whether we should not be working towards different solutions or different approaches. So that's a kind of a big Pandora's box I'd like us to open, right? So if you could share some of your thoughts on that, that'd be perfect.
And I will be first. This is very risky question, especially for a person who is working for public institutions. But I will be radical right now. I don't think that we can combine capitalism in this form and ecological intelligence. So that is my first sentence. The second is, I'm always wondering why it's so close. It's so close and easy to cooperate between the governments and political institutions and science. So they are much closer than political institutions and art. Like, it's oversimplification, but I'm talking from my perspective. So I'm thinking that the reason is, and when I was listening to you both, I really think that I'm right, that poetry is so powerful. It's like dynamite. So it really can change people's mindset, because their poetry is exposing people to feeling. And when you were talking, Grzegorz, in your lecture about this science with the capital letter, this science is super close to state, to power, to government, to capitalism, but it's super far from art, because this type of art, like poetry, is giving the power of resistance to people. So people like using poetry can be much more resistance to the current order. So I think that this is for a reason why political institutions, they prefer to be in a safety zone with big science, not with radical space with poetry and art, because this element of resistance is so intensively there. So I believe that if we really, and we are trying sometimes in our organization to really make some space for a different form of creating policies. And I believe that if we incorporate more art into policy space, this bottom-up emancipation will appear finally, and people will understand that it's not even possible to connect GDP and ecological intelligence. But right now, people are not so sure if they understand all elements. So we have to create them the conditions that they will connect the dots and they will give us this answer. That's all from me. Sorry, my radical voice was speaking right now.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because also, yeah, you're talking about the arts as kind of forming a kind of resistance or resilience in terms of communities, which I think is really interesting. And so, and what you're not saying there is that it's the kind of the medium for communicating something. So you're putting it in a really kind of different place. And I think, and I think that's important, because I mean, I was listening to the very interesting panel before this one, where you know, there was a comment. So yeah, I think you know, George Marshall was commenting that, you know, climate poetry is not going to get us very far in communicating the kind of urgency of climate change, and that if you want to communicate, then maybe football, soap opera, TV drama would be better. And these, but I think very often, you know, mass media is sort of instrumentalizing communication, and it's very kind of tied into those that drive towards progress and profit and accumulation and extraction. And the other thing that happens within that is that it's constantly disguising itself. And I think that is one of the main problems that we have, that, you know, that actually sort of the solutions of neoliberal capitalism may look utopian, they may look plausible, they may promise something to us, but when we really start to think about those connections and relationships, we realize that, you know, it's the whole system that needs to change. And so for me, I think, you know, this idea of the ecological imagination is one that invites us to make visible the connections, make visible what it depends on. And so when I was talking about the copper wires, you know, connecting my Zoom call with Jana when we were working on her poem, you know, I was also thinking particularly of work by Jennifer Scapitoni, and a really interesting sort of poet and multimedia artist, you know, who's worked on exactly this. And, you know, this idea of the thing that we call the cloud, you know, which sounds like a kind of natural phenomena, you know, it is in fact this, you know, this sort of highly sort of polluting and environmentally sort of costly kind of network of data farms, you know. And so how do we understand this materiality, you know, and that is underneath what we're doing now, and you know, making that evident is part of the ecological imagination, but it's in conflict with the promise of easy communication and constant progress that we're being offered, you know, which is also helpful to us, because look at us talking now. It's you know, we also use it. We're absolutely inside it, and that's the other thing. And, you know, we are inside neoliberal capitalism and its forms, and that's the other sort of difficult paradox of this situation. But we also need to see it for what it is.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I agree with the things that you say about capitalism, and also am glad that you resist instrumentalization of art and poetry, because that's it, right? It's seen then as a fix, so it sort of fits into the system, but it can also function as a challenge. I was thinking about the other part of your question, Gregor. Are we too late? Huh? How should we? I think that the German philosopher Ernst Bloch wrote about about hope in a political sense, and he says that we need to learn to hope. So, and with that he means that we need to learn to hope as a political practice. So not as individuals, but as communities. And as a really important aspect of learning to hope, he sees imagining utopias, different kinds of futures. And I think that also connects to the things that we were discussing earlier. So how can these different ways or these different viewpoints on the world help us think collectively about alternatives to the status quo, alternatives to capitalism, but also alternatives to the exploitation of the earth and living with other animals. And I think that part of this might be in the story, like discussing other stories. But I think that one of the other things that came up today is that we also need to develop different kinds of practices to think about this together. Yeah, that was a very valuable insight from what you both discussed today. So, but yes, our duty to, I'm not very hopeful individually, but I think that politically and democratically, we do need to learn to hope in better ways, because very often the climate crisis is also sort of narrated as a kind of catastrophe that will destroy everything anyway. So what's the use of writing poetry in 2021 or 2022? But I think that there is a need.
Right. Thank you so much. That was very insightful. Yeah. And my last question concerns joy, because this is something that is very important for all of us. This is something that was mentioned in the previous panel. This is something that Julia Fiedorczuk has mentioned in her lecture, and I find this very, very important. I like to finish on that note. So I wanted to ask you, can this ecological intelligence that we're talking about unlock certain unknown pleasures, other modes of satisfaction and happiness, things that perhaps we forgot about or things that we have not even considered so far? So do you have any any idea whether it pushes us towards new joys?
I'd like to just comment on something I've thought a lot about recently. Since I was working with Julia on the presentation of one of her poems in translation, as it happens, for school kids, and she did a recording of some of her poems where she kind of takes on the body of an animal and then and kind of thinks about what it would be like to inhabit that. And they are from her book Oxygen, and they're wonderful poems, and I really enjoyed that permission in her work to kind of think about a world of shared senses with animals. And I think perhaps before thinking about that with her, I'd always been a bit afraid of assuming too much from an animal's point of view, and I think her thought that animals also they're hungry, they have energy, and share this space with us. And I think about that every morning when I go for a walk around my town and watch the squirrels, and that gives me a great deal of joy. but it's a joy that is also informed by thinking through poetry, and actually particularly through Julia's, who is somebody I know through translating poetry, and is part of that extended community. And I would say that, you know, these extended friendships, often through text, sometimes with people I know, sometimes with people I haven't met, I've just read their work, that, you know, that in itself is joyful, that you feel that you're in this kind of shared space. And then you can also discover new ways to think about actually where you are, and your immediate encounters with others. And for me, particularly in these sort of months of lockdown, you know, living in my locality, you know, just the creatures I encounter around me have also been important in terms of sustaining that joy.
Yeah, I just want to briefly continue on that point of seeing those other beings as the other beings that they are. As I mentioned earlier, I wrote a book about animal languages, and I think in general there's kind of in biology, but also ethology, a turn towards the animals. So for a very long time, animals were mostly studied on the basis of whether or not they resembled humans. So animal language was studied on either if these animals could speak in human language or if they could understand it. And now there's kind of a turn towards their modes of being, their ways of engaging with the environment, and so on. And for writing that book, I was just reading so many studies about how animals communicate with one another, how they experience their surroundings, what kind of social relationships they have with one another, the kind of love affairs that they might have. Being in love is very funny. Lots of animals fall in love with each other. Well, they have all of these ways of caring for each other, or negotiating territories and so on. And I think that really changed my view on everything, you know, and it's like Zoe, what Zoe says, if you go outside for a walk, you don't see the kind of random birds in the sky, but you see people creating communities in other bodies, in other ways. And that's really valuable and really nice also, because a lot of the animal rights work is quite horrific because it involves a lot of violence and a lot of destruction. But yeah, writing about animals and language was a very enriching experience. And I think once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see all of the different communities, you just know that you're sharing the world, and it has a sort of comfort, because life is hard also for us, right? The ones you love die, and there are so many things that are actually horrible. It's a very, being alive is a very difficult condition, but it's also joyful, and you share it with others, and it's comforting that they create meaning. So that is one thing that I wanted to say. And the second thing is that just briefly about veganism, a lot of people kind of frame veganism as a something meager or horrific. You know, you have to give up all of these things and your life will be, you will be one of the pale people in the back chewing on a leaf of grass or something. But I think that spiritually, which is a weird word and I don't usually use, but kind of it actually is a very enriching way of being in the world, because it sort of allows you to be more attuned to the lived realities of others who also suffer, and to be sort of to occupy a different relation in a different position in the power scheme or something. That I find also joyful. So that's just a short note to kind of counter that view.
Grzegorz, you gave us the simplest question at the end. That was very nice of you. So, of course, it's super joyful. Everything connected with building this intelligence could be and is joyful. And first is, I would love to tell you that I truly believe, and I saw that in our processes, that when people are together, so I'm coming back to the community topic, they are happy that I'm not alone. Being decentered is happiness, because being in the center is super stressful. When you can experience that all other beings are equally important, it's also a relief, and it's also a joy. Discovering and exploration, what we need here right now, it's also a joy. But you cannot be together, and you cannot experience stress all the time. And also fighting for decolonization of your mind and body, when you finally succeed in that, this is also a great joy, that you, for example, you are finding new language to express yourself, or you find a new way of using your body. That is also a joy. So every element of building this ecological intelligence, it's totally joyful, and we have to really concentrate on that.
Thank you so much. That was a very joyful note. So in order not to dispel this sense of being satisfied and joyful, I think we can safely wrap it up. I wish to thank you so much for this hugely engaging and illuminating discussion. I hope that everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you to all the panelists, and of course also the panelists in the previous part, and of course to everyone who worked so hard to put this all together and make it possible, especially Climate Kick and the School of Ecopoetics. I wish everyone a great many joys, and I hope that you stay strong and take care. So thank you so much again. Big love, and hope to see you soon. If not via Zoom, then or be live, then in person, hopefully. Thank you so much. Take care and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you all. Thank you.
Yes, great to